Hello and welcome to the Book Show on Diversity TV. I'm Ava Colby, a writer of fiction, nonfiction, and poetry. My Facebook and website are Ava Colby Books. Today I'm going to talk about the book Finding Herself, Pathways to Identity Development in Women by Dr. Ruthellen Josselson. Now, technically it's about women, but it technically also could apply to anyone. I first saw this book because my dad randomly found it in a place called Ochiko or the Bins in Portland, Oregon. It's a place where the Goodwill actually sells things in bulk just to give it that one last chance to sell the items. And it randomly caught Dad's eye. He was always buying these different random books about all different subjects. And he brought it home. He would read just about anything. He was curious about everything. I don't know why it caught his eye, but it did. It was published in 1987, and why it's about women is the doctor was trying to put forward the idea that women needed to be studied separately from men. Back in the day with psychology, men usually from a middle-class background were studied, and what they found out in those studies they would apply to everyone, which I find a bit bizarre because it is so very much against the socio-cultural approach to psychology, which was a theory that had been put forward before then. And nowadays people embrace that idea more, that your gender, your ethnicity, your culture, your sexual orientation, your religion, and other factors can affect what would be considered normal or average or healthy mental states or behavior for you. But this still wasn't being done back when she started these studies. Dr. Josselson notes on page 2 that before the feminism of the 1970s, any woman who asserted herself and didn't just do what her husband told her to do was considered to be neurotic, unhealthy, and suffering from penis envy, which Freud thought basically all women did. And no offense to him, he made important contributions to these studies of the human psyche, but he stands as a prime example of why you need to become aware that there are multiple perspectives. So back before the feminism of the 1970s that some women like to criticize now, not realizing how much we've all benefited from it, if you weren't just subservient to the people around you as a woman, you were considered neurotic. And women were not studied separately. So she has what she admits was a limited study because to follow up with these women later, she could only use women who were in her original study, which was a small group. But it puts forward this idea of studying women separately, which is very important. But also she gets into identity types, and she says there are 4 basic identity types. And I will explain them now. This is going to be an oversimplification, but for the purposes of the show, just to introduce you to the book, this is going to be necessary. So she had foreclosures, or those who followed the same path since childhood. They continue to believe the same religion as their parents taught them, and they really missed a step in adolescence where you rebel or you have a little identity crisis, you question things, you challenge things, and after that you have a stronger sense of self. These individuals missed that step, and so they just followed their family's path and they haven't really challenged it and become their own person. Their identity achievements, who did go through that period of crisis or rebellion in youth, and because of that they have a stronger sense of self. They, for example, if they were raised with a religion, they may have questioned that, they may have challenged it, and they may, for example, if they were raised Christian, go to a different type of Christian church than their parents do. So they have a good, strong sense of self, and they tend to have good, solid, productive lives. There's identity crisis, which kind of speaks for itself and means the person's all over the place, and identity diffusion, which is worse than crisis because there is no real sense of identity at all. There are only fragments. Now, when I read this book, I was 22 or 23 years old, and Dad and I saw my mother as identity crisis, but he couldn't tell about himself, and I was sorry to say that I thought he was identity diffusion. and we talked some. He was more willing to face truths than her, and then I went off by myself and gave myself a good think. And I did not have a good solid sense of identity at that point in my life, which didn't surprise me given the parents and the family I was working with. I'm a writer, and I used to dabble in some fantasy scenery art, some drawings, and taking photographs and some other artistic pursuits. But after reading this book, I made the extremely painful and difficult decision to take all that other work and burn it. And that was very painful for me, but I thought at the rate I'm going, where I'm all over the place like this, I'm never going to be successful. I need to pick one thing and be really good at it, or I will continue to just be all over the place. And if I'd kept all those pictures, I would have felt I needed to do something with them. I needed to sell them. I had talked to a cafe owner before about displaying some of my artwork, and he said he was very interested in that. I had a very unique style, but he said I need to have it in frames. So I said, okay, I'll do that. And I was going to get around to that. And I thought, this is just going to lead me nowhere. I need to pick something and be really good at it and get some focus and some clarity in my life. And I have to do this very willfully, because I'm obviously not going to get that from my family. And no offense to them, your parents aren't perfect, they have their limitations. But I needed to get some clarity and focus in my life so I could ever have any success. Some of those picture concepts did make their way into my novel, Live Boldly, Fear Nothing, where the lead character is a fantasy scenery painter, and while he's going around and also being a vigilante. So my picture ideas live on. This was very painful, but it really needed to be done so I could get some identity and get somewhere in my life. I would challenge anyone to read this book and see what they think and who they are, though most people lack the objectivity to correctly analyze themselves or even their close family. My mother was an amateur astrologer, and she often read things into people's astrological charts. Now, at 22 to 23 years old, I actually got a bunch of different books from the library, and I was reading them to try to understand what she was even saying, because she would often go off on these ramblings about astrology, and I wouldn't understand what she was saying. And I thought, I want to figure out what it is she's even saying when she says there's the latest crisis because Neptune's doing this, and it's in this house, and it's all messed up. So I read some books so I could figure out enough to write notes down. And she's talking to me on the phone, going on and on about the latest supposed astrological crisis, and I write it down and I go, okay. So Neptune is doing this with this, and it's in this house. So instead of it meaning everything's going to disintegrate, could it not just mean we're all going to be very artistic, or we're going to learn scientific things? This is, you're talking about Neptune. So it governs some of that. And then she'd go, oh, well, that is another way that you could interpret it. Yeah, it might just not be a crisis. Of course, what you find out from this is how open to interpretation astrology really is. And that was when I realized it. I also realized that her interpretations tended to be fatalistic. They tended to be negative. And in fact, I realized that her and my dad's birth certificates did not have their specific times of birth. In astrology, the exact time of birth is extremely important for a natal chart. So I figured out that she had guessed the times of birth, and she had guessed wrong, and she was reading things into the charts that were not actually there. For example, her stellium of planets in Leo was not in the 9th house. She liked to think it was the 9th house, the one governed by Sagittarius, the one that would govern things like international travel, and she'd never left the country, and higher degrees in university, and she never finished her degree. Really, I think they were in the 10th house, which would indicate someone who, for example, maybe would have been a really good preschool teacher, because she was really good with really little kids. She was actually. Just when you got older and started thinking for yourself and questioning everything, that it would start to annoy her, even when she's the one who taught you to think critically and form your own opinion. But anyway, she actually missed out on a lot of potential that she had by trying to be someone that she wasn't. She didn't need to be all 9th house Sagittarius. She could have gone with 10th house, go be a preschool teacher, bring joy to kids. She was good at that stuff. And that's very important to have those early positive experiences for a child. Anyway, That's only if you believe in astrological theory anyway, which has some issues due to cosmic drift and more. Anyway, I think now more than ever, people need to think about identity formation in and of oneself and one's personal boundaries, particularly because of all this technology we live with, and the often constant unrealistic messages from the social media that everyone is constantly exposed to. People are being shown half fictions on social media, even of people's lives who are people that they know, close friends and family and people that you work with. I have known people who have this perfect portrayal of their life on social media, and when you talk to them away from everyone else, they're on the verge of crying. They have crises going on. They've got a family member who's addicted to heroin. They're nearly breaking up with their husband. They've got all kinds of crises going on, but they have this perfect image on social media. And that is very difficult for your mental health, and also very difficult for an identity formation when you're constantly proving yourself on social media or getting these unrealistic images of other people's lives on social media, and not getting a break from this kind of thing when you go home. You used to be able to go home and you could get a break from this. Now with our phones the way they are, with social media the way it is, you're not getting these breaks. You're not getting a break from this constant pressure to be this, to be someone that you're not, even because of these expectations with social media. So I think it's more important than ever to spend time by yourself. Read a book like this, think about your own identity, think about what you want to do, separate from everyone else, and establish that as a boundary. Actually put some boundaries on social media and the toxic elements of it. It's not all toxic, but a lot of it can be. And speaking of boundaries, when I was growing up, it would have been unheard of for a boss to call you on the phone when you're at home after work at all hours. Normally, if you left work, that was it. I have had a boss that thought it was fine to send work emails at 7 or 8 at night, to contact people about work stuff on the weekend when they're on vacation. And those of us who are a little more prone to stress would be driven crazy by this, would be really stressed out from it. Those that weren't would just say, oh, ignore it. That's just her being crazy. But this is the kind of toxic thing that is a real problem these days, because people aren't perceiving these boundaries. That, yes, just because the technology exists doesn't mean you should be contacting your employees about a work thing at 7 or 8 at night, or on weekends, or on their vacation. You need to back off. You need to respect some boundaries here. And when we don't have these clear established boundaries, there is also a problem with identity formation. In this particular case, it is someone thinking that your work life is your identity. I've also been party to some WhatsApp chats that were a staff WhatsApp for the teachers, and they would go on ad nauseum on weekends about this, that, and the other, with people trying to outdo each other with the funny jokes or the perfect weekend activity picture. And that gets into a sense of that your work life is your identity. Your work life, or the functions that you perform at your job, are not who you are. They are not your identity, but people are getting that all mixed up. So I've had to discipline myself to ignore things like that unless it really is a workplace emergency. I had to learn to simply not respond in order to create a boundary that some bosses and some coworkers don't seem to know exists. So I've had other workplaces where I was getting texted off hours and be, okay, what is it? And I think this is not a workplace emergency. This is not something my boss absolutely needs to contact me about right now. So I'm going to pretend I didn't see that, because I'm not going to set up a standard where it's expected of me to be answering all these workplace related messages when I am at home. I'm relaxing, I'm with my family, maybe we're having a barbecue, and I do not need this. And you would not have had to explain that to someone 15 years ago. So between all the mass media and the selfies and all these boundary violations, I think it leads further to this identity confusion. I highly recommend this book to help you learn the importance and sanctity of developing your identity, to help make sure you don't become a foreclosure, a crisis, or a diffusion. And I would hope that all the young people are able to become identity achievements and have their lives work after them in that way and not be limping along. If, like me, you had to do the work a little later because of the sort of family environment you grew up with, you can still make that identity. You have to make that choice and put that effort in, but you can, and it'll just be a little more difficult. So with respect to the importance of identity, I shall read from the 2nd chapter. Identity is the stable, consistent, and reliable sense of who one is and what one stands for in the world. It integrates one's meaning to oneself and one's meaning to others. It provides a match between what one regards as central to oneself and how one is viewed by significant others in one's life. Identity is also a way of persevering the continuity of self, linking the past and the present. At the same time that our identity is fundamentally interwoven with others to gain meaning, contrasting ourselves with others heightens our sense of what is uniquely individual. Often we learn who we are by discovering our differences from others, by finding out how we may distinguish ourselves from those we feel most like. A young woman I knew told of how she came to learn she had special musical talent. One day in 2nd grade music class, the teacher was trying to help students understand the concept of musical intervals. My friend, however, simply named the notes. "That's a G and a D," she said. The teacher, astonished, began playing other notes for her to identify, and each time the child named the note correctly. The teacher told her that she had perfect pitch. Now it was my friend's time to be astonished. "Doesn't everyone?" she asked. Identity thus becomes a way of judging ourselves with respect to a typology or set of values that is meaningful to others with whom we identify ourselves. Within a professional community, for example, each person has some idea of how she or he fits and understands that peers respond to the same nuances of accomplishment, recognition, and status that the group deems significant in evaluating others. Outside this community, one may be known as, for example, a doctor and be responded to and evaluated by a different set of standards. Identity formation. Over the course of a life, particularly as the cycle of significant others and meaningful interactions widens, identity is continually refined. The process of identity formation takes place throughout the life cycle, beginning just after birth as we gradually become aware that we have a self, continuing to old age when we come to terms with the meaning that the self has expressed in the larger scheme of things. In psychological terms, identity is neither a structure nor a content, but a property of the ego that organizes experience. Identity includes but supersedes all previous identities. Choosing an identity is not like choosing a college. There is no one day when it happens. Rather, the self is gradually modified so that one day one may look back and realize that one has changed inexorably, that one is different from how one used to be and is still essentially the same. Identity, then, is a dynamic fitting together of parts of the personality with the realities of the social world so that a person has a sense of internal coherence and meaningful relatedness to the real world. To say, for example, "I am a psychologist" is a statement of occupational identity, but it does not define overall identity unless all that one is subsumed under being a psychologist. Even to say "I am a woman, a mother, and a psychologist" does not define identity because it merely lists aspects of an identity and gives no information about how these parts are synthesized or how the person experiences herself. Social role is just one aspect of identity, although being the most visible, it is most available for study. We do not yet understand how identity changes as social roles fluctuate or whether social roles are derived from identity. Clearly, some people have always been able to create social roles for themselves out of a strong sense of whom they wish to be. They have caused society to adapt to them. Others, most people in fact, are likely to choose a social role from those that their society offers readily. Identity, in contrast to social role, is largely unconscious. Once formulated, it allows us to function almost automatically without our having to ponder each of the thousands of choices made in a single day. With a smoothly functioning identity, we can take ourselves for granted as being who we are. So that is my recommendation for you today. Thank you for watching the Book Show on Diversity TV. We will see you next time.